Hello, everyone. My section of our presentation will be on forestry management practices for biodiversity in New England forests. So why are New Hampshire forests important? New Hampshire is the second most forested state in the country, second only to Maine, and over 83% of the land area is covered by trees. The majority of this forested land is privately owned, with the rest of it being owned by local and federal government, local, state, and federal government. There's a huge economic importance on our forests here. Forest-based manufacturing within the state contributes $1.15 billion annually and is responsible for supporting 8,160 jobs. And that's not even mentioning recreation and tourism related to forests, which brings in $1.12 billion annually to the state economy, as well as supports 11,401 jobs. There's, of course, also an ecological importance. More than 500 species of vertebrate animals live in New Hampshire forests or in New Hampshire in general, and 27 of these species are endangered and 14 of them are threatened. Also, this is only the vertebrate animals. Of course, there are also invertebrate animals that are supported by New Hampshire forests. So I'm going to go over some of the common forestry techniques that are used to manage forests. So there's four main ones we're going to focus on. One of them is clear cutting, which you may have heard of. You might have some ideas in your head about what that is. We'll go into that a little more. One of them is retention, selective cutting, and non-intervention and other techniques. Clear cutting was ranked worst in terms of local species richness loss. So it is not very good at supporting biodiversity. Retention and selective cutting are both kinds of systems that do not completely clear the land, but take certain trees and harvest certain trees. And we'll talk a little bit more about non-intervention, but there is not a lot of research on that kind of management technique. So clear cutting is a form of forestry management where most or all trees in an area are uniformly cut down in one harvest. Now, this has been and still is the dominant technique for forestry in North America, Europe, and many more regions on Earth. Some of the advantages of this kind of forestry management is that it's much cheaper to cut all in one time. And also, you have the largest volume of timber with this method. Some of the critiques of this method are that it simplifies forest structure and it leads to a more homogeneous forest structure, which is not very natural and does not support biodiversity in the same way as, for example, an old growth forest could with all the complexity of that system. So based on a global meta-analysis, clear cutting leads to an average of a 22% reduction in species richness. And some other environmental effects include soil erosion, water contamination, increased wildfire risk, as well as reduced carbon sequestration. So a little bit about the retention and selective cutting systems. Retention is a technique where certain trees are retained to maintain structural diversity, supply seeds for the next crop, protect the understory, etc. And selective cutting is similar to retention, where individual trees are harvested and it makes small openings throughout the forest. It's similar to retention because both of them do not clear the land in the same way that clear cutting does, but at the same time, selective cutting harvests even less trees, whereas retention is maintaining some trees for the sake of biodiversity. Selective cutting is only taking some trees for the sake of biodiversity, if that makes sense. Now, the pros of this kind of harvesting is that more heterogeneous stand structures are maintained. So it's kind of a more natural forest structure that is maintained. It's not all even aged because of this kind of harvesting. So some results of this kind of of these kinds of techniques on biodiversity include no notable reduction in biodiversity from a global meta-analysis. Selective cutting lowered the harvest-related loss of population or individuals in 72% of studies compared to clear cutting. So clear cutting is quite clearly much worse on biodiversity than retention and selective cutting. And some of the other advantages of selective cutting is that species are supported over this regeneration phase because of these stands of trees that are still left there. They're able to move, and while the trees are regrowing in the places that they were harvested, there's still habitat to support them. And landscapes are more connected, so habitat is less affected because of that. And here's an image that kind of shows the differences. Now, we're not using the term shelterwood logging, but this is similar to what a retention system would look like here. So here we have clear cutting where the majority or all of the trees are cut. Here we would have something like retention where individuals or stands of trees are left while the rest is cut. And then selective cutting, you can see here, some trees are cut, the mature trees are cut, but the majority of the trees are left standing. So one other thing that we're going to focus on for our research is at the Andorra Forest, they do two other kinds of sustainable land management that might not be very common in a forest, for example, that is being used for commercial timber, commercial harvesting, because these are not very profitable kinds of techniques, because some of the land in Andorra Forest is never touched. There's no forestry management. There's no intervention at all. Then also there are some areas where they are taking the trees, they're cutting them down and they're mulching them, and they're leaving the chips to decompose. If you were in the Sustainability for Organizations class, we went on a field trip to Andorra Forest and we saw some of that technique there. But because these techniques are not very common and they're not profitable, so they're not common in this commercial space, they have very little research available on them. So I could not find research about how these techniques are affecting biodiversity, but maybe that could be something that our group is going to be researching at the Andorra Forest. And yeah, so that is my section of the presentation.